Welcome back to CrimsonCast. It's been a while since we did an emergency podcast, but it's definitely the right time to do it. Romeo Langford officially commits to Indiana University to play basketball in one of the most overextended commitments and recruitments that we've seen in IU lore, but one that definitely had a positive ending on it, and we can all be happy for that. I'm Galen Clavio. Joining me on the show, my co-host, Scott Caulfield. Scott, it took Romeo several months to commit to IU. It only took me about 3 minutes to commit to this podcast. Do you feel good about how quick my decision was?
I did. I mean, I was happy you picked me. Well, you did do another podcast.
I actually did. I was on assembly call before we got this one. So they recruited me first. I felt like I owed them something.
Yeah, I mean, but they have that whole, FBI scandal going on, so I'm surprised you picked it. It's funny when you think of, Romeo Langford being tied with Damon Bailey going for the scoring record, and two guys with maybe the most, Bailey had probably the shortest recruiting where he signed in 8th grade, and then you have Romeo who waits to the last minute, like maybe two of the most diverse types of signing. But hey, I mean, it's, well worth the wait. Welcome, Romeo.
Times were different back in 1989, I think it was 88.
Yes.
But so let's just dive right into it. Obviously, this was a day that a lot of people were excited about. Maybe some people were concerned about or nervous about. And it certainly was an unusual recruitment for a lot of reasons. And we're going to try to delve into what those were and what made this such an interesting process. As I mentioned on Twitter, you go back to late February, early March of 2017, and it's hard to see the path to where we're at right now with IU basketball picking up the Romeo Langford recruitment. I mean, they were not really on the radar. You certainly Louisville was pretty far ahead. Kansas was in the game. Vanderbilt were starting to make inroads, and there just didn't seem to be any juice whatsoever for Romeo Langford going to Indiana University. For all of the things that had to happen between then and now to have occurred in order for Romeo to make the announcement today that he's coming to IU, it really just demonstrates, how quickly things can change in college sports.
Yeah.
For IU to fire Tom Crean and then make the right hire in Archie Miller, and then, Archie to really start the process of trying to bring the Langfords back into IU's orbit. And then, of course, the FBI investigation, really takes Louisville out of the running. And then, we don't know what exactly happened over the last month in terms of the Langfords' ultimate decision, but we do know that from what Tim Langford said in one of the post-announcement interviews, that as far as he was concerned, Kansas was no longer in the running because of the fact that their name came up in a more recently announced indictment. I mean, just a lot of stuff had to happen in order for this to be possible. And, it's one of the things, Scott, I know that when going back to the Crean situation last year, one of the arguments against making a coaching change was always, we're going to lose ground with these recruits that we've already got lined up, or these guys might decommit. And it just highlights how futile and foolish that line of thinking often is when it comes to college basketball, because you can change things so quickly that, in a year's time, your entire, next 5 years can be completely different based upon who you're able to attract.
And it's nice actually winning a recruiting battle against, Kansas versus like Trinity or whoever we were going against at the end of the Crean era. I mean, it's nice. No, I think we all have to thank, Rick Pitino and the FBI scandal for kind of messing things up in Louisville, because that's probably where this kid would have gone, regardless of anything that we did. But, things happen, and then we need to be there to pick it up and get it done. And I think, to your point, this does really show, we were nowhere on this kid's radar. Even when Archie got hired, we were not on his radar, and Archie made it a commitment, got it done. And then I don't want to get too deep into the next level. We'll talk about Romeo tonight, but as you look at, the 2019, the 2018, 19 class, the 2020 class, like you start to see things lining up where you have a lot of, good recruits lined up there. It's amazing that we're only about a year into the Archie Miller process, and you're already seeing tangible results. And this was a good win. I was listening to one of the Inside the Hall podcasts, and Alex Bow just made a point I thought was interesting, that really, like, it's kind of a zero-sum game with recruiting. Like there's really no winning take. Like the kid only goes to one school. And so, like the idea of that it would have shown well that we got that close and it would have been kind of good, but it's not like kids are like, well, I want to go to IU because Romeo almost went there. That's
the Josh Smith corollary from the 2000s, right? He'll always be a part of the IU family. That'll bring in a lot of players. It didn't bring in a lot of players. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. But I mean, it's huge. I mean, I think it's one of the, only 2 or 3 top 5 players to even come in the Big Ten in the last 15 years. So it really shows that we are on the right path, and it does hyper drive this. I mean, it gives Archie a lot of now new, weapons for next year that we didn't have this year.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you look at the way that the team is constructed at this point, now you have a bona fide, like true talented perimeter scorer to throw into a mix where you already have an incredibly talented, post scorer in a guy like Juwan Morgan. You've got a lot
of the best 10 players in the Big Ten next year.
Well, possibly, yes. And you never know how younger players are going to integrate, and when we talk about the 4 stars that were already in this class, whether it was Robert Finney or Jerome Hunter or Demezy Anderson or Jake Forrester, I mean, there's always this concern with freshmen that they're going to have a little bit of trouble getting going in the process of becoming a college player. You don't feel that way about a guy named Romeo Langford because he's got the level of talent that we've seen over and over again at places like Duke, places like Kentucky, at places like Kansas. The likelihood of him being able to slot right in and play at a very high level from the get-go, it's what makes him such an important recruit. And what you said is correct. I mean, it is a zero-sum game. I wouldn't have been that disappointed if he hadn't gone to IU because, again, at the end of the day, it's really hard to take a guy at that talent level and completely turn him around in terms of his thinking and recruiting in that amount of time. And, the fact that he visited IU and got to see Archie Miller coach up close, despite the fact that this was not a vintage IU team by any stretch of the imagination. There were a lot of tough games, where they didn't play particularly well. But, Langford made a mention in one of the post comments, the post announcement comments that I saw earlier, where he basically said, one of the things he really liked when going to IU games, I think it was the Illinois game, was that Archie Miller and the coaching staff were all coaching all the players up consistently. They were letting them play through mistakes. They were letting them learn from things. These things do make a difference. And, so for Langford, for a guy like that to come in and for IU to be able to get a guy like that is, I think they would have been fine, and the Archie Miller era would have been fine without him because there's a really solid base already established as far as recruiting. But now, if you're first of all, if you're on the team next year, you're going to have a superstar on the floor with you, and that makes everybody's job easier. But now also, if I'm, Trace Jackson Davis, or if I'm, one of these recruits that's a sophomore or junior or whatever, and I'm looking at IU, I'm thinking, wow, that's a destination place. It's what's allowed a place like Michigan State or some of these other schools that have consistently gotten top level players. It's what's allowed them to kind of keep their name in the game with these top recruits for so long. You do pay attention to where other really good basketball players go when you're making your own decision about where to go.
And I think the other thing too is, I don't want to turn this into a pile on Crean podcast, but what I will say is I think this does highlight Archie Miller is good. Has some skill at luring players because, a lot of the guys that Crean got, it was kind of, we were either their best offer, like a Thomas Bryant was kind of kicking around near the end and didn't have a lot of other offers, or same with Noah Vonleh. Like there was, circumstances where it's like we ended up kind of being these kids' best offer, or like an OG Anunoby. It's like we were the best school at the level he was getting offered to. Like this is one where, again, we came in late, but you're going up against Kansas, a massive blue blood. Now, I understand the FBI thing's out there, but there's still, like, you go to them, you might be going to a Final Four next year, and you're also going, you have Vanderbilt, who, while not a power, I mean, a lot of his friends, Garland's going there. I honestly thought he was going to go to Vanderbilt just because when I was, like, if you and I were in high school together and we were both stud athletes, I'd be like, I want to play with you. Like, that's the way a lot of the NBA is going, is like guys want to play with their friends now. And so I thought that those are both really good pulls. And you look at this and it's like we had, except for the fact that it was in state, a lot of things were stacked against us. And yet Archie was still able to help Romeo see why Indiana was the place to be. So to me, like, this is a real win because it shows that Archie obviously knows what he's doing when he's talking to these recruits, and he's able to persuade them to tell that Indiana story, which I'm not sure Crean was always able to do.
Well, and look, I mean, we're seeing this in some of these comments that I'm looking at on Twitter. So Andrew Hussey from the Indiana Daily Student with this on Twitter. Romeo's father said IU basketball assistant coach Ed Schilling's player development played a role in Romeo's decision. And I've seen that thread pop up a couple of times. The idea that if you go to IU with this coaching staff, you're going to a big program, sure, but you're also going to a place where you're going to get developed. And that was a pretty constant thread, both with Tim Langford's comments and also with some of the stuff that we've seen Romeo talk about so far. That stuff matters. I mean, it's not going to matter to everybody, but with this particular recruit, it seems to matter. And that's something that probably was a reason why they weren't that interested in coming to IU before the change was made. I mean, you have to think that plays into the decision somewhat. So, look, I think that this is a unique sort of situation for IU because there's just been such inconsistent recruiting over the course of forever. What this really is kind of reminiscent of. I was on the Rivals podcast with Jordan Wells, and I compared it to
another God. That's what I'm third. I'm third in line.
You've been traveling, man. I gotta keep myself busy, But I compared it to, as far as like the hype, okay, you had the Eric Montross recruitment, which went against IU, and that was really kind of the missing piece of the puzzle for IU to potentially win the national title, in 92 or 93, maybe. You had the Jared Jeffries recruitment.
Right.
That one kind of said, hey, IU is still kicking. We can still go up against Duke and get a recruit. You compare it obviously to Cody Zeller, which was, kind of the culmination of supposedly Tom Crean, putting IU back on the map and being in line for things. But this recruitment, as I think about it, really is the Eric Gordon recruitment all over again. Like, here's a guy who, Romeo Langford was not committed to Louisville, but he certainly wasn't looking at IU. And, if everybody remembers, Eric Gordon was committed to Illinois. He wasn't going to go to IU, and that was largely because they didn't want to play for Mike Davis. And so when a change gets made and Kelvin Sampson suddenly becomes the coach and the future of IU basketball suddenly looks a lot different, a change happens in Eric Gordon's mindset. He ends up decommitting from Illinois, ends up committing to Indiana. So this is a similar sort of deal where even though there's not a decommitment, recommitment, the charted course of the program changes. And now all of a sudden, there's a desire on the part of not just a Romeo Langford, but other top players to go to IU again. It is, again, like you said, you don't want to turn it into a pile on the previous coach sort of deal. And it's not even so much that it's just Crean, but it's been IU basketball for the last 20 to 25 years where the players that have come here have either been bad fits, if they're top level players, whether that's Andre Patterson or a Noah Vonleh or somebody like that, or IU's had to basically recruit a level down from what they normally would as opposed to recruiting up at that highest level. So, we won't know for another 2 or 3 years whether this is a one-off like the Cody Zeller recruitment seemed to be, or whether this is something that builds into a much stronger and more consistent wave. But with the way that the rest of recruiting has gone, when you put this piece among that in the puzzle, it really does portend well for the future.
And to pull your analogy just a step further, I mean, the thing that's interesting is you also have the kind of the big man that is coming into his own. Like you had DJ White with Eric Gordon, and that team really had a nice little 1-2 punch. And you have the same thing here with Juwan Morgan. You know, I'm assuming he stays and doesn't stay in the NBA draft. That you have him coming back, and you know that team with Eric Gordon and DJ White, you know, it got derailed because of the whole phone call Samson thing. But I mean, by mid-February, they were playing some of the best basketball in the country. Like they took down, what was it, Michigan State and Purdue, or I forget, or two teams in the top 10, like back to back. And they were just steamrolling when that went down. So no, I think it's fair. Here's the question I want to ask you. Before we talk about Romeo and the team, like how it's going to help us and what we look like next year, I do wonder, like, is this going to be able to help us at all in the scheduling? Because like I know I was at some of the Pacers games last week, and they're already advertising the Indiana the Classic will be at Bankers Life, and it's like Michigan State, Kentucky, North Carolina, Duke, like the teams that were not there. And you do wonder, like now you get Romeo for 1 year, like that would have been a great game for us to have been in. Is it too late in the process for us to even get anything that we may not have gotten before? Because of having this, having kind of a marquee freshman on the team.
Oh, I mean, maybe there might be one or two things, but I'd say most of the big stuff's fairly set. And look, I think without knowing exactly what's going on with the schedule, certainly there'll be the opportunity to showcase IU basketball a lot more next year than what we saw this year. Even if the games don't change, the times, I think, probably will, and maybe the location. I mean, last year, IU got a bit hidden on television, and rightfully so. I mean, they weren't that good of a team to watch, all told. But now you've got a guy that people are going to want to see. And, that's going to get spotlighted. That's going to get put in more primetime situations. And so I think it certainly doesn't hurt. Anytime, and this is the thing, like a lot of the top level games that IU used to get, they haven't gotten in recent years because outside of a few, select years over the course of the last couple of decades, they just haven't been consistently good enough or had consistently compelling enough players on the national scene for people to really, want to see them in those sorts of marquee matchups. So it's a beginning. It's not an end. And I think you're going to need to see, consistently bringing in players and developing players of this caliber. But it certainly has to help as we move into next year.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that we wanted to look a little bit at the basketball implications of all of this, and we got a couple of questions on Twitter already.
They're good, right?
It was good. Yeah, it's positive. But Craig DeChemin and Brian Gavitt, I apologize, Brian, both asked Craig asked who starts in backcourt with Romeo, and Brian says, what's your 2018-2019 starting lineup? And this is it's an interesting question. I mean, I think
Romeo is going to be a great six man. I'll just put it out there.
You think he's
coming? I think off the bench, he's going to be really good off the bench.
It is interesting. One of the ranking systems, the T rank by Bart Torvik, with the Romeo, they try to do these futures things where they will project based upon incoming talent. And the Romeo commitment actually bumped Indiana up to 21st in the nation in that projection, which, I mean, who knows if that's actually, anything close to reality, but it does make a big difference. I think it's informative to talk a little bit about what or who is coming back on the roster right now. And there might be some changes still. We never know, although we're pretty late in the game for people to announce transfers. And it certainly seems like, provided Juwan Morgan comes back, you're going to have the roster that's there, plus the recruits,
and
plus a grad transfer. Anyway, go ahead.
No, and Juwan Morgan, I think this helps give him another reason to stay. I mean, I think he's going to test his stock, but I think this is if you're Juwan Morgan, like you mentioned, this is going to put us in a little more of a marquee setup. You have a guy who can get you the ball. I think this, if you're Juwan Morgan, gives you more of a reason to stay, unless, some NBA team is we're going to take you in the first round.
Right. And I mean, I doubt that will happen, but you never know. So
let's assume he's coming back.
Assume that everybody's coming back, that nobody is leaving or transferring, and you've got the group coming in that you've got. So you think about the roster as it sits at this point. You've got, you've got backcourt players of Al Durham and Devontae Green, and then Romeo Langford certainly fits into that mix as well. And then the incoming players, you've got Finney and you've got Anderson, who's a little bit more of a, kind of in the swingman role. You've got Hunter, you've got McRoberts, and then you've got Justin Smith, you've got Clifton Moore, you've got Deron Davis coming back, you've got Morgan, you've got Forrester, and you've got Race Thompson.
Yeah.
So that is, let me just double check my math here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And McRoberts, of course, is not on scholarship. So you're going to see almost certainly a 14th player. We saw there was a player from St. Mary's who's a grad transfer who had an official visit to Indiana this past weekend. So that will be interesting. There might be somebody else that pops in. If you look at that lineup and not knowing at this point if you do have a grad transfer coming in, who it would be, my guess at this stage would be your starting lineup to start the season is probably Green, Langford, Justin Smith, Juwan Morgan, and, this is where the fifth one's kind of an uncertainty, but I could, everybody has so many good things to say about Jerome Hunter. I could see him starting. But, you've got a lot of depth. You've got certainly Deron Davis potentially having a starting spot. Maybe that's what you end up doing. In fact, I'm going to take Hunter out and just for the moment put Deron Davis in. So that gives you a starting lineup of Green, Langford, Smith, Morgan, and Davis with, Finney and Durham coming off the bench as guards, and then Anderson, Hunter, McRoberts coming off the bench as swingmen, and Forrester and Thompson coming off the bench as post players. That's a pretty good lineup right there. How that lineup coalesces, I don't know. And there's certainly a possibility that as you go down through the season, that you're going to see some changes. I mean, nobody at the beginning of last year could have foreseen that Zach McRoberts was going to end up as a starter. And yet he was halfway through the season, and he was basically an entrenched starter from the start of the Big Ten campaign on. So, I think one of the cool things about this roster is there's going to be competition for spots. That is, I think, the hallmark of really good basketball teams, when you have a bunch of really good players and they have to push each other and play and push themselves to get playing time, because they want to start, they want to play 20 plus minutes. And that what makes you better is knowing that I have to beat out this player if I'm going to get a chance to get on the floor. That would be what I would look at right now and say, well, okay, let's start with that group, because that's a pretty experienced group. That's a group that by and large played pretty well throughout the course of last year. I feel confident with what we could start there, but I wouldn't be shocked to see 2 or 3 guys in that list that I just gave you not starting by the end of December.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at my starting lineup, I had Deron Davis in there as a starter. To me, the kind of the question mark spot is that 3 spot. I agree with you. I think Justin Smith will get there. I kind of see McRoberts starting to start the season, just because he was such at times he was the second or third best player on the team last year, and he certainly is possible. Certainly. Yeah, I mean, and he does. The thing that's nice is he does a lot of those things you need done. And if you have Romeo on the team now, that you get some scoring where he's the deficiency on offense isn't as big of a liability as it was. But I think you're right. I mean, as I kind of star people who I think will start throughout the year, Juwan Morgan is there, and it's always tough with freshmen because you just never know, but you have to assume Romeo Langford is going to be starting throughout the year. Everybody else, like Deron Davis, Justin Smith, McRoberts, Devontae Green, like Al Durham, like those are, you're right. There's 2 spots where I think we're going to get stability. I think the other 3, it's not going to be instability in a bad way. I think it's going to be people fighting for spots, and you're going to get people raising their game, which I think is going to be good.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole conceptualization of the team right now. You don't have to just build around Romeo Langford. You've also got Juwan Morgan, and the fact that you've got those 2 players makes both of them better, because you can't concentrate on one or the other. Last year's team, largely felt like it relied on games where you could get good contributions from, you'd have to get at least 2 other people hitting, and it was always a kind of a mixed bag as far as who that was going to be. By towards the end of the season, Robert Johnson was chipping in more consistently. I think he finished with like his last 7 games, he was in double figures, but there was a stretch of 3 games and 4 in the middle of the Big Ten season where he didn't break into double figures. And so the idea that you're going to have consistency from a couple of positions, and those positions do different things. The idea
the
that
guard forward combination is really nice.
Right. Yeah. And look, I think it also takes a lot of pressure off of other players. It takes pressure off of the freshmen to have to contribute immediately. You don't have to be in a situation where you're, a Robert Finney and you have to run the point right away, because not only do you have Devontae Green who's there, but you've also got Romeo Langford who can handle the basketball and probably will want to have the basketball in his hand. If you're a Jerome Hunter or Demezy Anderson, you don't have to produce immediately because you'll have people to play off of, and you should get more open looks. I mean, that lack of consistent scoring threat, or at least consistent, the idea that you had to defend somebody all the time last year, other than Juwan Morgan, it really didn't happen on a consistent basis until the end of the year. And I really think that hurt the performance of a lot of players. So, the overall development of the team last year was positive, even if the season didn't end up positive. But now you've got a whole nother offseason, and you've got a guy who comes in and is ready to go right away. And certainly there are things Romeo Langford has to do to get better. That's part of the reason why he's coming to Indiana. But the idea that he's going to, like, the things that Romeo Langford has to get better at are going to be different than the things that some of the other freshmen are going to have to get better at, which in turn should help those other freshmen.
Yeah.
So that's the way I look at it. I mean, I'm really curious about how this shakes out, because the other big thing that is interesting to me is how Archie Miller and staff continue to develop this team defensively. The fact that there was as much buy-in as there was defensively down the stretch last year from this team was a really good sign. And if you think about the players that IU lost in this offseason, really outside of Robert Johnson and maybe Freddie McSwain, I don't know that they lost anybody that was a really stalwart defensive player. And so you're getting the cream of your defensive crop back, and you're going to be adding some young, athletic, and aggressive and hungry guys who are going to, come in with a blank slate as far as understanding how to play defense. The coaching staff won't have to unteach those guys. They'll be able to just teach them. So that will create, I think, a much stronger defensive identity, for this team. And that's really going to help moving forward, because if, you're always going to have, offensive ebbs and flows, particularly with freshmen. But if they can become a really good defensive team, I think this team has the potential to challenge for the Big Ten title. I mean, they were fourth in the conference last year in defensive efficiency, and I really don't look at the roster and say, wow, they lost all these key defensive players. So I'm really excited about that and how that manifests itself as the season develops next year.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I think it's fair to say we have 2 of the top 10 players in the Big Ten coming in the next year with Romeo now and Juwan Morgan. And depending on, how good he is in college, it could be 2 of the top 5 players in the Big Ten. And for all the things you said, I agree with. And the thing that I think is kind of the quiet hidden secret here is the guy that nobody really talks about. And even when we're putting together our rosters, neither have I really highlighted, but I think Race Thompson is going to be a hidden gem next year. You have a guy, 6'8", he was a 4-star recruit who redshirted. I mean, he basically is coming in with a year of he's got as much experience with Archie Miller as anybody else in this system. And that 6'8", that's a great kind of size for the Archie Miller system. I foresee him being somebody who's going to plug in a lot of different ways and kind of take that Josh McRoberts spot even to the next level with a couple more attributes. So I see that as kind of almost the hidden gem with this team going into next year.
You could be very well right. And I think that it's easy to forget Race Thompson. It's easy to forget that, IU is, even though there's still some question marks about guards going into next year, and are they going to have enough guard support to field a backcourt that's consistently good? the team's going to get bigger next year. And, a little bit of that is height, but a lot of that is going to be in muscle and bulk. And you think about Race Thompson coming in, you think about Forrester coming in, suddenly you've got a couple of bangers that will fundamentally change the interior of this IU offense and defense. And particularly if Deron Davis can come off his injury positively and can increase his footwork ability, now you're dealing with a very powerful and very potent post attack for this IU team. And that's something that really hasn't been a consistent thing for IU in quite a while. Obviously Archie seems to like versatile athletic players, and that's good, but you're able to have that and also have some more rebounding ability, the ability to bang in the post a bit. That's a really interesting and intriguing potential future for IU. We had another question, this one from Ta Laujaratsang. I think I butchered his last name. I apologize, but do we see Romeo as a guaranteed one and done? Yes. I think, look, here's you never know. I mean, you never know for sure, but the guy would have been probably a top 10 pick. It would have been a lottery pick this year if there had been no one and done rule. And I look at that and I say, that's probably not going, I don't see a situation where he's going to, not play well enough to live up to things next year. Certainly we've seen the occasional top player not go to the pros after being thought of as a one and done, but I don't see that as the case here. I don't know. What do you think, Scott? I have more thoughts on this, but I want to get to you first.
Yeah, I mean, from all, it's really tough because you're watching him play against high school kids. And that's why, Giannis with the Bucks now, in the NBA, it was tough to figure out how good he was because he's playing against guys in the YMCA in Greece. It's like, is this guy good or not? But what you have to go off of is, like you mentioned, there's been reports, from the NBA that was like he would have been a top 10 or 15 pick now. And so given that, most of the time when that happens, even if guys kind of, struggle in college, they look at Ben Simmons, he didn't really blow the doors off in LSU. They didn't make the tournament. He still was in the top, 2 or 3. So I have to assume, unless things completely fall off, he's going to be projected as a lottery pick for next year. And he's a one and done. And I do, it is funny as this process has gone on over the last year and a half, and you see IU fans kind of going back and forth, and you kind of get the overreaction, the underreaction, and the idea is we don't even need one and dones. Teams without, one and done. It's I get the sentimentality of yes, there's, Michigan is built on non-one and dones. All that said, it's all about the number of shots you get at it, and having more shots like Duke and Kansas and Kentucky, and the one and dones aren't a bad thing. And if I said, Galen, I'm going to give you a Ferrari to drive, but you only get to drive it one day, you're not going to be nah, I'll stick with the Subaru for the next 2 years. I'd much rather have my 5 stars for a year and then move on. But yeah, I think barring something that is unforeseen, he's going to be a one and done.
And as I've mentioned in a couple of other spots, we need to embrace that. As you just mentioned, I've never understood the antipathy towards one and done players, particularly with the IU fan base. It's like, if you're good enough to go to the pros, that's a good thing. It's a positive deal. The idea that nobody complains about Victor Oladipo or Cody Zeller having gone early to the NBA. That their success at that level. I mean, obviously Victor far more than Cody at this point. It reflects well on the university. It reflects well on the basketball program, and the idea that we don't need one and done players. You kind of do. I mean, yeah, Villanova won the national title, and they don't really have a one and done style player on their team. But if you've got those sorts of players, your team is probably pretty good. It's not 100% guarantee, but you'd much rather have the talent on your roster than not, particularly if you've got a culture where you've got other really good players that those players can play with while they're here. Obviously, I think Jared Morris from Assembly Call mentioned this, that Syracuse with Carmelo Anthony coming in was kind of a best case scenario for this Romeo Langford thing, where he came in and they were, a top 30 team coming into the year, and they end up catching fire at the right time at the end of the year and making the NCAA tournament. Kentucky's gotten certainly a lot of criticism from IU fans, and some of that's a cultural thing, and some of it is perhaps, got other legitimate basketball reasons. But at the end of the day, those Kentucky teams are talented enough that by the time you get to the tournament, they're normally pretty good, even if they lose a bunch of players to the NBA afterwards. IU is nowhere near that. And, there's no reason why anybody should be allergic to the idea that an awesome basketball player who's good enough to make money at playing basketball professionally, that somehow that we're above that at IU. That's the kind of attitude, frankly, that's left IU as a certainly a not top tier basketball program for most of the last 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, the two other thoughts I have on that is, part of the reason, we can hate him as IU fans, but part of the reason Calipari has been as successful as he is he's made it very clear the biggest night of his life is the NBA draft. It's not the Final Four. It's not the championship. And for a majority of these kids, that's what they want to hear. It's like, a lot of these kids, whether you like it or not, like, they want to play in the NBA, and that's what they want to do. And so if it's like, I could win a title and not play in the NBA, or I can, flame out in the Sweet 16 and play in the NBA, they're going to take that second option 9.5 times out of 10.
Well, look, and I'll say this, it's a good point. I think it's important to remember for people, you can afford to be an arrogant fan base and an arrogant basketball program if you're consistently winning titles, conference titles or national titles. If you're consistently a top 10 program, you can afford to be arrogant. I could understand like North Carolina or Duke or Kansas saying, well, if that kid doesn't want to play for us, then, we'll be fine without him. We don't need we don't need a guy who's going to come in for less than 2 years. But even Duke, who, was one of the most successful programs of the 2000s, Mike Krzyzewski changed his approach and said, we're going to orient ourselves towards, really, really good basketball players. Even if they only want to come and play at Duke for 1 year, we'd rather have that. IU does not have any room for the level of arrogance that sometimes you've seen with people reacting to this Langford recruitment or previous recruitments, because, the there isn't there. It isn't 1993 anymore. And, you're not sacrificing your principles as a basketball program by bringing a one and done in here or there. Like it's unfortunate that the sequence of events around what happened with Kelvin Sampson occurred the way that they did, because, having Eric Gordon on IU's roster did not create some kind of, complete breakdown of the system that IU basketball sets itself up around. So, things like that, I'm happy that we hopefully won't have to have that conversation for a while. And I think Archie Miller's got a really good sense of the types of players to bring in. So hopefully this just becomes the new normal. I think a lot of the reaction that people had to the Langford recruitment were that the fact that IU really hasn't been that competitive with these sorts of players before. And, hopefully what we'll see with Archie Miller for a while is that IU is a player for these sorts of recruitments on a consistent basis.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I like too is just, it's a really nice PR win. I mean, this has been a huge recruitment, and it's a good PR piece. I mean, it's, I firmly believe one of the knockout blows for Mike Davis was not getting Greg Oden. Like, this stuff can bring down coaches, and not that would have all happened to Archie, but it's just on a flip side, like this has been a big recruitment, and it's a really good PR win. Indiana gets a positive cycle. I mean, I have tons of people who I just know, who aren't even into basketball, just talking about, hey, what about Romeo? Just people are just, it's like, it's a topic. And now people walk away like, Indiana's, hey, I guess they're back again. They're doing well. And like, we get a news cycle. We get this. It's good. I think it's nice to win one of these. I don't think it would have been awful for us to have lost it, but I think it's really good. And what I feel good is that I feel like the team is in place in the coaching staff and at the university to actually take this and take it to the next step, use as a stepping stone to continue to grow, to have more of these. And to your point, if we're going to be that kind of program that I want to get these kind of, high level players, we're going to get to need to win more of these kind of high level battles.
And look, it's not just about making the media happy. It's about the fact that basketball players pay attention to where other basketball players go to school, and it is a draw. They have to actually go there. That's why the Josh Smith corollary is not applicable here. Like just saying you're going to go and then not actually going, that doesn't work. But But especially in state, and especially with this inside out recruiting philosophy that Archie Miller announced last year and has carried through. Adam Cohen, one of our esteemed IU sports media alumni, pointed out that now in 1 year, Archie Miller has recruited a 4-star, a 4-star, and a 5-star out of the state of Indiana. And from 2015 to 2017, Tom Crean had one in-state recruit, and that was Grant Galen, who was a 2-star. It's
hashtag the movement. Sorry.
Well, and you even go back to the movement. That was the class that kind of, I guess, severed the relationship between Tom Crean and in-state high school coaches and AAU coaches by and large. It is important from a public relations perspective to get this sort of a recruiting victory. And I think it's also important, the way that everything has been conducted over the course of this recruitment, not just of Romeo Langford, but the rest of this class. It really does seem like the coaches in the state of Indiana, whether they are, AAU or whether they're high school or whatever, they look at Archie Miller and they look at this IU program now much differently. And certainly some of that is Archie Miller. Some of that is the assistant coaches. And, the idea that they want to do business with IU basketball and vice versa, that IU basketball values players in state and really puts a premium on that and doesn't seem to be afraid of being in state. For whatever reason, that seemed to be the case with the prior, and again, it's not just a Tom Crean thing. Tom Crean was the most recent example, but it was the same with Mike Davis, where, Davis didn't, whatever reason, just didn't make the connection and wasn't able to consistently connect with the people that mattered in the state. And it's not like it's rocket science. I think it just takes a certain type of attitude and a certain type of willingness to talk with people and interact with them. But the two coaches who had the longest tenure at IU over the last 20 years just couldn't get the job done on that front. And so to see this recruitment happen, to see IU pull in the highest rated recruit in the Big Ten period since Jared Sullinger, and for that player to have been an in-state recruit that wasn't looking at IU 13 months ago or very loosely looking at IU 13 months ago, that has to have positive reverberations on future recruits. And you look at the recruits that Archie Miller and staff are trying to pull in, it's a lot of Indiana kids that are very highly rated. We mentioned Trace Jackson Davis earlier. Keon Brooks is one that
we're fighting with big boys again. We're fighting with the Blue Bloods again.
Right. Yeah. And so that sort of thing, this is how you start to build towards that.
It's nice to see it because, both Davis and Crean kind of did lip service to, putting border around Indiana. We're going to do it. And then within 3 years, it's like, hey, we're going to a pipeline to the east. We're getting pipeline to the south. Like all of a sudden, we're getting these pipelines out of Indiana. It's really nice to look at, you look at Archie Miller's recruiting for the next 2 to 3 years, the guys who lined up, like you mentioned, they're all Indiana kids. Like it's funny how easy it is for coaches to stray from that or just unable to kind of make those connections at the Indiana level. And it seems like that's been our history is like, hey, a new coach comes in, and again, not even Crean thing, Davis, even Sampson a little bit. I'm going to come in, I'm going to recruit Indiana. And then within 6 months, it's like, hey, we got to get connections in DC. It's like, well, that's not Indiana.
It's just, I'll say this. One last thing I'll say, and then we'll wrap up with final thoughts.
I want to get some predictions for next year, your thoughts on that.
Well, okay, before we get to that, I'll say this. And I said this on my personal Twitter account. It is really neat to me as challenging and as argumentative as people have been as far as being IU fans over the course of the last several years, really last 20 years. It's cool to have these rare moments when everybody's pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about the fact that everybody's excited about this. This is it's very much a similar sort of memory to what it was like after Cody Zeller announced. And that Cody Zeller announcement, I think, was a lot less. This one, as much as we didn't know for sure, this one kind of felt like a foregone conclusion going in. By the end of things, it really did not feel like Kansas was going to be a player or that Vanderbilt was going to be a player. So the Zeller announcement was a little more climactic in nature. But even with that, this is about as celebratory of an attitude or atmosphere that I've seen IU fans in since that point. And I remember the aftermath of that. I was at that recruitment with Cody Sherritt and Courtney Cronin, who were a couple of our student reporters at the time. And, there was just like this incredibly positive vibe that settled in right after the recruitment. It's like, wow, IU basketball feels important again. And it's been very rare for IU fans to really all be able to get on the same page and say, hey, this is great. We feel really good. I mean, you think about all the things that have happened, in the 90s, it was, pro Knight versus anti-Knight, and people are like, we need to move on, versus people like, no, this man is a legend. Then the firing happens, and that causes the split in the fan base. And then you get Mike Davis, who, I mean, for a moment gets the whole fan base on his side and then gradually loses them over the course of several years. Then you get Kelvin Sampson.
Don't forget that rap video at the end of the Davis era.
Yeah, that didn't help. You had the Kelvin Sampson era, and of course that doesn't need to be rehashed. Crean comes in and they spend 3 years wandering the desert. They have a couple of years where everybody's kind of on the same page, and then that fractures again. So I really relish these particular types of moments because this reminds me of what it was like, being an IU fan back in the 80s and the early 90s when, the idea that people were going to be like critical or upset or disappointed with what was going on with IU basketball, there were so few of those people that they didn't really matter. And, the sort of unified fan base that you see that a Duke or a North Carolina or a Kansas or, some of these big programs have, Michigan State kind of, I mean, they've been like that as well. It's cool for at least a little bit of time to feel like the IU fan base is among that ranking as well. So hopefully that lasts. I mean, God knows, everything seemed great going into last year, and then the Indiana State game happened. But, it's nice to have these types of moments and just to be able to enjoy them and see everybody else enjoying them at the same time.
I agree. No, I it's well said. And I remember being in my office talking to you right after the Zeller, kind of that going into the Zeller's first year, and just thinking like, this is going to be good. Remember we talked off the air. I'm like, I could see us getting to a Final Four in the next year or two. Like, we're good. And we were, and it was a fun 2-year ride. And then it was just like, then it just ended. I remember thinking like, I'm going to enjoy this, but I felt like it was just going to keep on going, and then it stopped. And like, I'm having that same feeling now. I just hope we can continue it. But I'm with you. It's a good time. It's enjoyable. And it's like literally sitting at dinner with my wife tonight, kind of thinking like, damn, I'm ready for Hoosier hysteria. Like, it's been years since I'm like in the middle of May thinking about Hoosier. It's kind of like, oh, like, well, at least I have 5 months where I have to deal with Indiana basketball again. Like, now it's like, oh, I cannot wait for Hoosier hysteria. It does. I haven't had that feeling enough in the last 15 years.
I'm with you. And this has been, by comparison, one of the most drama-free off seasons that IU basketball has had in a long time. I mean, and granted, you still have somebody transfer, you can still have somebody do something, but it doesn't seem like it since, it's May as of 3 hours from now. It's just
first reported here.
Right. Yes. Breaking news. It will be May soon. But it feels like a positive time to be an IU fan. And we haven't had a whole lot of opportunities to say that in the past several years.
So very, very early predictions, sure to be wrong about a kid who's never played in college before. But what are your predictions for us in the Big Ten, postseason tournaments? And then, is it fair to say that now we are in a point where, going into this next year, we kind of discussed like, NIT, NCAA, like, are we at a point where NCAA is pretty much, not making the NCAA is going to be a bust year? But I'm curious your thoughts on where we finish in the Big Ten. What's our ceiling? What's our floor? What are your thoughts?
I don't know about floor. I think this team can win somewhere between 12 and 14 games in the conference next year.
You said conference. You had me scared for a second.
No. And it's hard for me to make a projection as far as overall record because I just don't know who our schedule is going to be against. I mean, you figure I think the addition of Romeo ratchets up the ACC Big Ten Challenge opponent. Like, I would not at all be shocked now if we're playing like Virginia or somebody of that caliber, which is fine. I'm all for that. But I think 10 taking that aside and not knowing exactly what the non-conference is going to be, I think between 12 and 14 wins in the conference is entirely doable, given that, you know, the team was certainly in competition to win, you know, a decent number of games in the conference this year. And so, you know, you take that and you look at it and you say, all right, what does that equate to? You know, you go 9-9 this year. Is Romeo worth 4 additional wins? Yeah, I think so. That him plus the other players coming in, plus the players coming back. I think that's well within the range of possibility. So that probably equates to, I mean, they could win the Big Ten title. I think they'll finish top 3. You know, and I mean, that could, you know, you might be within a game of the conference title and still finish in the top 3. But I think you add that sort of a talent, that's what you're going to be able to do. As far as the tournament's concerned, again, it completely depends on the non-conference schedule. But I think that Archie's scheduling philosophy, if they end up as a top 3 team in the conference, I don't see them being seeded lower than like 6th in the NCAA tournament. So I'll say that. We'll start with that. I'll say definitely back in the tournament, a top 6 seed and top 3 in the conference. I don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility at this point. I mean, I would go back to Cody Zeller's freshman year. The team that was on the floor at the end of the year prior to Zeller joining IU finished 12-20. And not a whole lot of people were projecting that IU was going to even make the tournament that year. I remember we got into some arguments with some of our fellow media members about what the ceiling was for IU. And a lot of people were saying, well, they're probably going to be the NIT again. And I'm like, I remember saying, no, I think the minimum expectation is probably an 8 seed in the NCAA tournament. I think it's a similar sort of thing here. I mean, to me, this year's team was better than that team in 2011. This team was 16-15. I think they showed a lot more promise defensively than that team did. And I think that Langford will make that much of a difference. So, yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I'm even, I don't want to be wrong, but I even have higher hopes for next year. I think there's something special about this. The thing with the Zeller, you know, this Romeo recruitment is unlike any other recruitment I can think of. Like, just the amount that it was drawn out, the amount of hype, the fact that it was so kind of like it drew in almost everyone in the state. You know, I see there being a real buzz in most games next year. I could see us going undefeated in Assembly Hall next year. You know, we were already tough to play last year. I think the place is going to be, you know, pretty well packed for most games next year. I think it's going to be a tough place to play. And, you know, you look at, you know, if you assume that Romeo is as good or a little bit of a net positive to Robert Johnson, and then you figure that all the other freshmen can take up kind of what Josh Newkirk did and a little bit of Freddie McSwain, this team is better. Then you just have the improvement of a Juwan Morgan. I mean, there's not a lot of losses that we had from last year's team. And all the upgrades we know should be at least the same, if not a lot better. Not to mention, you know, you're having, you know, 5 freshmen I'm kind of putting in the Newkirk McSwain spot. So I really think this team has a shot to win the Big Ten and be a top 4 seed in the tournament. And has probably, you know, just depending on how they coalesce and how they do things, you know, has a shot to get hot, like, you know, and we'll see what happens. I'm not saying they're going to win the title of Final Four, but I think they have a real legitimate shot to win the Big Ten. And I also think, you know, if you're Archie, this is a, you know, from all we can tell, Romeo is the kind of kid who's not, you know, a lot of good recruits come out of Indiana, and we see a lot of kids who are lined up well, but Romeo seems to be kind of a special recruit. Like, you're not going to get one of these every year. And so I do think there's probably something from a Archie. It's like, I know I'm young in the career. I know I'm starting here, you know, early on in this Indiana career, but there's something special here. And not that I'm not going to try other years, but kind of this, like, you saw it with Crean. Like, Crean really put a lot of effort, and like, he really did some of his best coaching when he felt like I had that team that was really, really special. And I don't know. Maybe I'm just in the afterglow of a really big announcement, but I foresee us having a real legitimate shot and probably winning the Big Ten, and then, you know, a good shot in the tournament because we'll have a good seed.
Never make projections when you're giddy is one thing that we've learned over time. But we've thought about this for a long time, since we've had a couple of months since the season ended to think about what the ramifications of the commitment would be. So, look, I think right now, I do think it's funny. There's not really any sort of a sense of how all of this will fit together, but I do think that from the standpoint of what Romeo Langford can do for IU, it's a tremendous amount, and I don't think there's any reason to soft pedal. I do think I'm very curious to see how the rest of the team coalesces around him, but I think that the other thing to keep in mind isn't that you're just adding Romeo Langford, but you're also adding another year of Archie Miller's coaching. And we saw, particularly on the defensive end, what a big difference that made. Now you're adding some scoring. Now you're adding some athleticism. I'm excited to see it. I love Archie's sense of the dramatic. Apparently, this was according to a story from Zach Osterman from the Indy Star. Archie Miller was at Little Zagreb's with the grad transfer that's on campus, making his official visit at the time that the Langford announcement occurred, which means the whole place probably erupted in celebration and cheers while they were sitting there having dinner. So that's the sort of theater and staging that Archie Miller seems to like when it comes to this stuff. I enjoy his sense of the dramatic. That's a really good way of going about things.
One last, this is me getting giddy, but let me just throw this out to you. One thing, because I bet on it, and I won one of my best office pools ever with the Syracuse. I picked them to win the title the year they did with Carmelo, partially because of Carmelo, but partially because they had a path where they were never going to have to leave upstate New York. Like, I think they played like somewhere in like Connecticut, like in the regional. Like, they just had a great path to get to the Final Four. And, the first round games for next year in the tournament, there is a Columbus, Ohio in the first round. But if you get to the regional sites, Kansas City is a regional site, which is drivable. But the regional site for the South is Louisville, Kentucky. So you talk about that's a place we could descend upon. You talk about Romeo coming home to Southern Indiana like that. There's something really interesting that that's the quiet thing that really screwed that team that lost to Syracuse was if they didn't play hard enough and they didn't win enough down the stretch, they could have gotten the 1 seed in the Midwest, would have been playing in, I think, Dayton and then Indianapolis. But they didn't. They were in DC instead. So that's just throwing that out there that if we have a really good season, it's the South region. So maybe we wouldn't get it, but maybe if we get the 2 or the 3 seed in the South, a regional in Louisville could be there, which could be really interesting.
A lot to look forward to with IU basketball, and we'll look forward to doing that with you folks as we move forward with things. Again, Romeo Langford commits to IU, and suddenly
all is good in the world.
All is right once again. Anyway, yes. Happy end of the month to all of you, and enjoy the off season. For Scott, I'm Galen. You can catch us on CrimsonCast via thehoosier.com. We'll be around occasionally during the summer. Be sure to check us out on Twitter at CrimsonCast.com. We will catch you folks on the flip side. So long.